Thank you. Before I came to graduate school, as Lena mentioned, I worked for a member of Congress. And that was a wonderful job. Our district was the whole eastern half of Utah, which means if you've been to Bryce Canyon, or if you've been to Arches, or if you've been to Dinosaur National Monument, that was our district. And I got to go visit those places and try to make them better in some way. And we had a lot of successes. We expanded Arches National Park. We got some legislation passed to move a uranium mill tailings pile that was sitting right on the banks of the Colorado River, which supplies drinking water all the way down into California, and had some other successes. But we also had what I considered a failure. This is a picture of the San Rafael Swell in sort of eastern Utah, about in the middle of Utah. And it's an incredible place, as you can see from this picture. It was a salt dome that sort of rose up and then eroded out. And so it's full of these canyons. It has petroglyphs all over the place. Really, really beautiful place. If you've driven on I-70 across the country, there is a point that also looks like, there's also a stretch in the movie Cars that looks a lot like this. But so if you've driven I-70, you've probably driven right up and over the San Rafael Swell. And in the late 1990s, the county commissioners from the area where this is realized that they had a big problem. They had this huge area. It's an area about the size of Connecticut. They had one Bureau of Land Management ranger who was supposed to patrol the entire thing, and it just wasn't working. They had off-highway vehicles driving around off of roads. They had petroglyphs that were getting ruined. It was subject to overuse in a lot of ways. And so these folks got together and said, what can we do to help manage this place better? And they collaborated with the local folks, so the people who were actually using that place for their recreation, and they came up with a plan. They called it the San Rafael Swell National Conservation Area. And it did a lot of things. It withdrew the area from mining and oil and gas leasing. It closed anywhere that wasn't already a road, so you couldn't just kind of drive around on there. And it provided a lot of resources to try to manage this great place. And I was working for that member of Congress at the time, and they needed, this is federal land, and so they needed us to pass legislation to get this done. And we tried, and we failed. We introduced legislation that I viewed as sort of a compromise. My boss was a conservative Republican, but the Secretary of the Interior, who was under Clinton at the time, a Democrat, was for that policy, for this piece of legislation, and it didn't do everything. In fact, there were sort of two big contentious issues. One was wilderness. In Utah, wilderness is sometimes called the W word because it's that contentious. Some people hate it and some people love it, and we try not to say it. And so it didn't actually create wilderness. So it helped protect the area, but it didn't go all the way, right? Wilderness is pretty extensive protection. This did some, but not the full amount. And then the second really contentious issue was those off-highway vehicles and whether, in particular, they could go in the places that were being studied for wilderness. And so this bill got all the way to the House floor. It passed through the committees, it passed through the subcommittee, the committee, got to the House floor, and it was discussed on the House floor. And sort of a series of amendments were offered that were trying to make it a little bit more protection for the area. Most of them, so some of them basically, we ended up with some compromises over those amendments. But one passed that my boss just couldn't accept, and that was one that wouldn't have let the off-highway vehicles go into the wilderness study areas, which I will fully admit, wilderness study areas are not supposed to have roads in them. That was sort of how they were drawn in the first place, but they did now. And so my boss pulled the bill, meaning he said, all right, let's stop talking about it. We're not going to pass this legislation. I can't go home to my constituents and say that I let this legislation go through because they'll be angry that they can't travel where they wanted to travel. And that has stuck in my brain for, I guess, more than 15 years now. I've worried about that, and I've thought about, like, what could we have done better? That was a compromise proposal, right? It wasn't perfect. It didn't do everything, but it made progress, and it didn't pass. And that's what motivated me to try to understand what I'm going to talk to you about today, which is why legislators don't compromise. And lest you think that I'm just stuck on this one story, we surveyed, this is from about 250 state legislators, and we said to them, we want to think about the gas tax with you. The gas tax in, say, your state is 20 cents. What would you like it to be? And if you said to me 40 cents, then in this survey, we said to you, how about 30 cents? Would you take 30 cents? That red quarter of our state legislators, almost a quarter, said no thanks. And that's a little bit puzzling, right? We would have expected you to say, well, the gas tax is 20 cents. I'd love it to be 40, but at least I'm getting something. At least I'm getting 30 cents, right? And a lot of them don't do that. That, I think, is a piece of the problem that we have in this country with what we call gridlock, right? With not getting legislation passed to solve real problems, to put resources in a place that has one ranger for an area the size of Connecticut, right? We have gridlock. We don't see the passage of legislation that might be really important to solving problems. And so, given that we're seeing this both in these stories, but also in this data from 250 legislators, I worked with some collaborators to try and understand why. And so the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk to you about why. And our first cut at that is we looked at all these things that might explain why legislators don't compromise. And the big piece that you see on that top piece is that legislators who said that they were worried that their voters would punish them, they were worried about high voter retribution, were the ones who didn't accept the compromise. In this study, we also saw a couple other things. Those in the majority and Republicans also didn't compromise. But it was really those legislators who were worried about their voters. And so for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk to you and try and understand, we're going to kind of go on a hunt for who those voters are, because legislators who are worried about their voters are about 21 percentage points less likely to compromise. So what do they mean when they say that they're worried about these voters? Which voters? And is there something we can do about it? So first, we're going to go on a hunt for those voters. Like, who is it? Is it you? Is it you? Is it you? Who is it who might be punishing these voters? So I'll tell you a little bit about our sort of expectations about who that might be. And then I'll tell you how we tried to understand who it was. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Tea Party, which is always fun. And then finally, in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to talk to you about solutions, because I really want to know how we might make this less of a problem. So, who is this? Is it general election voters? Is it sort of the general public who's punishing? We think probably not. The general public sort of shows up at the polls, they don't know very much, they tend to vote their party, and they probably don't have any idea how you voted on a piece of legislation if you're a legislator. So they're probably not punishing you for having voted in a particular way. Is it primary voters? Now, those voters do know something typically. They're a little bit more informed, and they might be the ones punishing. Or our favorite people to blame, right, are the donors. Is it the people who give the money? So, first way we tried to answer this question is we just talked to legislators. We went to the National Conference of State Legislators. This gives me a chance to introduce my collaborators. The tall one is Dan Butler. The small one is Laurel Harbridge. I'm in between. We went to the National Conference of State Legislators, and if you've ever been in an exhibit hall, we rented a booth in this exhibit hall, and we gave out free t-shirts to legislators if they would take a little, do a little survey with us. We gave them tablets and pens, and we asked them a lot of questions. And the first thing that we asked them was just like, who are you worried about? what is going through your mind? How likely do you think these folks, your primary voters, your donors, and your general election constituency are to punish you for voting for some sort of a compromise? And what they told us was just consistent with what I said. They were quite worried about their primary voters, they were a little bit worried about their donors, and they really weren't that worried about their general election voters. They really thought this was a story about their primary voters and their donors. And so we said, great. Well, let's see if we can understand what they think these voters want them to do. And so, same place, we had them on their tablets, and we gave them a little story about a member of Congress, somebody who shared their partisanship. So if they were a Democrat, we said, think about a Democrat who's facing this compromise, and it's this story of getting half of what they wanted, half of what their party wanted, but they're gonna be really important to this vote, they're gonna be pivotal, and and a lot of their party's gonna oppose it. What do you think their general election voters and their primary election voters are going to want them to do? And what we saw was that legislators said their primary voters are definitely, like 60% of legislators said their primary voters were going to want them to kill that bill, right? Kill that compromise proposal. So legislators are really worried about this. But the question to us was, well, are they right? Right? They could be wrong. It might be that they're concerned, but they never get punished. And so we decided to talk to actual voters, folks like you. We did a survey of over 2,000 voters, and we tried to understand what happened when they were faced with a legislator who accepted a compromise proposal, right? Who said, yeah, that's not perfect. We call it sometimes a half-loaf compromise. It's halfway towards what I want. Not perfect, but I'll take it. And what we found was that most voters, so on average all voters, that's the far left-hand side, co-partisan voters, so that's probably most of your primary election voters, opposing partisans, and even independents, all of them don't actually punish them for compromising. Instead, they approve more of legislators who compromise. So we had to go digging deeper because it wasn't sort of your standard story. And in fact, it wasn't primary voters. It wasn't people who oppose compromise in general. So if you talk to people, some people will say, you know, I really would prefer that my legislator stick to his principles. I don't want him to compromise. And other people will say, no, I want my legislator to compromise. I think she should listen to everybody and come to compromise. But it wasn't those people who oppose compromise in general who punished compromise. It was only this small slice, maybe about a fifth of the electorate or a sixth of the electorate, who opposed that specific compromise, who punished those legislators. And so you can see on the left-hand side that they had lower approval of legislators who compromised. And then on the right-hand side, they were less likely to vote for that legislator in the primary election, less likely to vote for that legislator in the general election. Small number of people, but you can imagine for a moment that each one of you might be that person on a particular issue, right? There might be something you really care about where you do not want compromise. You want your legislator to hold that line. And so we think that's why they're sometimes not compromising. They're not accepting these policies that seem like they should make things better. We wanted to understand, though, maybe this is just what they tell us in surveys, right? Maybe this isn't really going on. And so we looked at this era, we call it the Boehner years. Boehner was Speaker of the House, when the Tea Party was really important. And for those of you who don't know a lot about what we call the Tea Party, it was kind of an arm of the Republican Party. And it was described as here as a group that would not hear of compromise, right? Or a group that sought to loudly tell Republican office holders to do what they wanted, or we're going to run somebody against you in a primary election. And so we think this is a great example of the kind of voters who might care a lot about particular issues and who might be preventing compromise. In fact, Eric Cantor, who was a very powerful member of the House, lost to a Tea Party challenger. And one of his colleagues said, you know what that told me? That told me that negotiations or compromise can get you beat, right? They were out there, they were sort of scaring these members of Congress. And so we look at the 2011 to 2015, we look at those years and we go to their constituency and we try to understand if people who have more constituents, so more members of the public in their district who feel very positive or somewhat positive about the Tea Party, so identify with the Tea Party, if those are the folks who aren't compromising. And to do this, we have to find some compromise votes. We look at key votes, which is sort of votes that are picked out as very important. There are things like the Farm Bill at that time, which involved a big compromise over food stamps, or what was called the Grand Bargain, which was kind of around what the debt ceiling would be and whether we could raise taxes. These kinds of important issues that also required some Democratic votes. They were contentious within the Republican Party. And we said, do we see these folks who have these Tea Party supporters compromising less? And the answer at the top there is yes. If you have more people who like the Tea Party, who identify with the Tea Party, you're less likely to vote for those compromise proposals. So we see this manifesting in Congress in real time. It seems to really matter, right? It seems to mean that they're not voting for these compromise proposals. All right. So here's where we are. We know that legislators reject compromises at a fairly high rate, to me as a sort of surprising rate. And we know that they tell us it's because they're afraid of their constituents and in particular their primary voters, right? But what we know as researchers is it's not all those primary voters, it's just this little slice of the electorate. It's these folks who care a lot. Sometimes we call them an issue public. They're these people who deeply care about a particular issue, and the Tea Party is one example of that. They had some issues that they deeply cared about, and they were willing to punish candidates. They were willing to go so far as to find candidates to run against those members of Congress. And so this has real consequences for getting things done, which is why I'm deeply interested in understanding what we can do to help members of Congress compromise, right? Help them get around that little slice of the electorate that's really getting in their way. And so I'll talk for the next few minutes about some possible solutions, right? What could we do in the process of negotiation or in the process of how they are taking up these bills to maybe make this work a little better. And I'll go through two ways. The first comes from an organization called No Labels, and they argue that what we ought to do is have a focus on shared goals before we sit down to make a decision on policy. So for example, we might all get in this room and agree that we need to save Social Security. And we all can think about that and write about that and talk to each other about that and agree that that's a critical goal. And we should do that, they say, before we start to talk about whether we're going to do it with taxes or whether we're going to do it with the retirement age or whether we're going to do it, right, with all the different ways that you might think about fixing Social Security. So that's one possibility. And then the second thing that we'll look at is whether it might help to allow lawmakers just a little bit more privacy in their negotiations, right? Allow them to negotiate in private instead of in public, and whether that might help them to get a little bit of insulation from those punishing voters. So we'll start with the first one, which, as I said, comes from No Labels. They've published a book making this argument. And they provide for us some examples, right, of places where we might agree. We might all be able to also sit in this room and agree that we should create jobs, or that we should balance the federal budget, or that we should make America energy secure. And so we go to the legislators, went back to the National Conference of State Legislators, still gave out t-shirts, still didn't have red t-shirts. The Republicans were all like, why don't you have red t-shirts? We were like, we didn't really think about that. We had blue and green. And so we went back and we gave them their tablets and we asked them about this. And what we did to understand this is we said, suppose you agree with, we took half of them and said, suppose you agree with this legislator's Smith, who shares your goals. And in fact, we had them write about that goal because that way it would really be in their heads. And so they all took a piece of paper. Well, half of them took a piece of paper and wrote about it. The other half just sort of skipped this whole step, skipped this whole Legislator Smith agrees with you on these broad principles, and went straight to the negotiation. And then only after, with the treatment group, we call it, so it's just like any other kind of experiment you might do in a lab. We had a treatment group and a control group. With the treatment group, after they had written this, after they'd been told that Legislator Smith, who they were negotiating with, agreed with them, then we asked them what tools they would use to address it. The control just sort of skipped that. We just said, what do you want to do about this? And what we did was say, look, you're negotiating with this guy about Social Security, I guess, or a woman. Would you be willing to vote for this proposal that's, again, this half-loaf compromise, right? It's not quite what you want. It's not quite what that legislator wants. It's sort of a mix. And what we found was no difference at all, right? This does not seem to work at all. They're like, yes, happily we agree on Social Security, but we totally disagree on the reasons for that. And that might not be surprising to us because, you know, about a third of the public says if you compromise, you're selling out. And importantly, about a third of primary voters are sort of like worried about the means, right? Are saying like, no, it's not just about balancing the budget. You've got to worry about whether you're doing it with taxes or with spending cuts, right? So voters probably actually care about the means, and legislators know that, right? They need to get reelected. And so maybe this lack of a difference is not that surprising. So then we said, well, let's move on to try this public versus private negotiation. And what we said to the legislators is we had them read about, again, a sort of vignette, a story about negotiating. And we did a couple things in this. First of all, we said the key opposite party, right? So if you said you were Democrat, we said the key Republican legislators on the other side of this issue asked to discuss the issue with you. And then there's the thing that we vary here. So we have some who get public and some who get private. So the bold here is either they get asked to discuss it during a public meeting, right? Or they get in a closed door meeting. And then they also get either this statement that the local paper is expected to attend and report on the meeting, and they want to report on like the details and exactly what happens and back and forth and what you propose and what they counter propose. Or they get no press to be allowed. Of course, you'll find they'll be able to report the final outcome. So we're trying really hard to make this as equal as possible, but just vary whether these legislators are negotiating in private or in public. And what we find is that negotiating in private seems to increase their ability to compromise. So they tell us, yeah, I'm a little bit more likely to be able to compromise if I negotiate in private. But there's a little bit of a catch to this possible solution, and that is that they tell us, but I'm a little less willing to go into that negotiation in private, right? I'm a little bit worried about what it'll look like if I go into that negotiation in private. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong idea about what we mean by a private meeting, or to think that I'm advocating that we just close the doors of Congress and never hear from them again. That could be nice in some ways, but that's not what I'm arguing. What I'm saying here is there might be some room to give them a little more space in the negotiation process, right? We definitely want to know what comes out of that process, what policies they're voting on, and we want to be able to hold them accountable, right? That's really important to the democratic process. But there may be some room to allow them to negotiate without having to know the back and forth, right? Without the sort of like Twitter account of everything. We could just find out in one tweet at the end what they decided to vote on. And that might actually help. That might actually help them to be able to come to compromise. At least that's what they tell us. So it's not about the shared goals, but it could be that this sort of privacy of negotiation might actually help us to get a little bit more compromise in the policy process. All right. With that, I want to go back and think about the Rafael Swell example, right? Because I now realize that it was kind of a worst case scenario for this, right? They were negotiating about wilderness and off-highway vehicles on the floor of the House of Representatives. Not that a lot of people watch C-SPAN, but like, it's on C-SPAN, right? We know all the details. We know all the back and forth. And so I think in many ways, it was kind of it was a process error, right? We didn't have it hammered out what the compromise exactly would be before it became a public debate. I'll tell you quickly the end of the story, which is that did not pass. That bill did not pass. I told you that before. The area is still not particularly well protected, although some of the roads have been closed. So to me, the lesson that I've sort of carried with me since this failure is that, one, we need to understand why legislators can't compromise. Why can't they come to agreement and solve some of the major problems that are facing our country? And I think we have an idea, and we got to blame ourselves a little bit, that we kind of dig in our heels on our particular issues. And then secondly, what can we do to, in a sense, control either our own response or their response, right? So can we give them the space to solve problems, to protect places, to negotiate that agreement without getting involved in the back and forth? Can we give them that private negotiation? And I think that's one possible solution. I will say that we also talked to legislators about this, and they said to us, you know what we need to do? We need to communicate better to our constituents. And so I'm thinking really actively now about what would it take to convince me or to convince you on your issue that you ought to give your legislator a little bit of leeway to compromise so that we actually can accomplish some solutions, right? We can get some legislation passed. And so that's where this is going in the end, and that's my sort of hopeful note that I think there are some possible solutions to this lack of compromise. Thank you.